plantation. African Americans were kidnapped and brought to this country by European slave traders. Black men, women, and children were sold into slavery and lived out meager existences on plantations.
Even under those desperate circumstances, black people have exhibited their courage, strength, and talent. From the era of slavery, we remember Joseph Sinclair, Sojourner Truth, Dred Scott, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass, just to name a few.
Crispus Attucks demonstrated the courage and valor that would rival any man that gave his life in the Boston Massacre. Numerous black people fought side by side white soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Many people thought that this was enough to encourage the abolition of slavery, but it was not.
Truly ruled between the slaves after the Revolutionary War, and its main source of the disputes was slavery. The North and the South couldn't agree in the argument over slavery, and the United States found itself engaged in a civil war. The Civil War era saw an upsurge in the abolitionist movement. The word abolish means to get rid of it.
Harriet Tubman is known for freeing slaves on the Underground Railroad, but she was not alone. William Steele devoted much of his life to help slaves escape the Underground Railroad. He later wrote a book, The Underground Railroad, telling his story of how he freed 649 slaves.
Some African Americans thought that they would never be treated fairly in America. Some hoped for a better life in Africa. Others wanted to live separately in a portion of the United States, Central, or South America. Four such men were Marcus Garvey, Martin Delany, Henry McNeill, and Paul Cuffey.
After much turmoil and fighting between the North and the South, with it looking like the South would win, it became apparent that the black men that had been turned away or not allowed to enlist in the army were needed if the North was to win the Civil War.
On New Year's Day, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document stated that slaves from any state or district fighting against the United States will now be free. 5 days later, the first regiment of black soldiers entered the Union Army. The war dragged on for 2 more years, but President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was the first major step in bringing an end to slavery and the Civil War.
When the Civil War had ended, there are a lot of problems to be solved. One of the problems was that of ex-slaves. Should they be granted the rights that other U.S. citizens had? The problem was solved when Congress passed the 3 amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These additions to the Constitution freed all slaves, made blacks U.S. citizens, and gave black people the right to vote.
The Civil War ended April 9, 1865, and so did 250 years of slavery for African Americans. These freedmen, as we recall, needed someone to help them find housing and jobs. The planters were very angry over the fact that they were required to pay workers who they previously owned. When all hope seemed lost, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau. Now these ex-slaves can have help in finding work, wages, a place to live, and most importantly, education.
The post-Civil War became known as Reconstruction. The word simply means putting back together. We are learning in class that Reconstruction hasn't ended. Well, not for everyone. African Americans have continually fought for fair and equal treatment in this country for hundreds of years. Some of this fighting has been literal as soldiers in battles, but most of it has been done using the hearts and minds of brave and talented people. For example, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Daniel Hale Williams, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and James William Johnson. The struggle for equality took a completely different turn in 1954. 2 years before, Linda Brown was a 7-year-old black child attending a segregated school in Topeka, Kansas. Because black and white children weren't allowed to attend the same schools, Linda had to cross dangerous railroad tracks to catch a bus to school to attend an all-black school. But there was another school, an all-white school, close to where she lived.
Frustrated by the unfairness of segregation, Linda's parents petitioned the local Board of Education for their daughter's rights to attend school near her home. When their request was denied, they sued the board. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. 17, 1954, the court ruled in Linda's favor.
People were in such an uproar over the court's ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education that the stage was set for violence. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago who was visiting relatives in Mississippi during the summer of 1955. When he arrived, family members explained to him that he'd have to behave differently around whites in the South. Emmett did not heed their advice. While at a white-owned grocery store, Emmett flirted with a white woman. The following night, Emmett was dragged away from his uncle's house, taken away, and murdered.
Later that same year, Rosa Parks, a 43-year-old seamstress, refused to give her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a group of whites. The driver warned her several times to get up, but she refused. The police were called and Mrs. Parks was taken to jail. News of Mrs. Parks' arrest spread like a wildfire in one of Montgomery's black community. 19 black ministers called for a bus boycott. No blacks rode buses for 1 year. During that time, King's house and other houses of black leaders were firebombed. King traveled all around the country giving speeches and raising money to help support the boycott.
Hi, my name is Michelle Obama, and this is my husband, Barack. On May 1961, a small group of black and white passengers boarded a bus south in the name of freedom. They were called the Freedom Riders. Next week, we will embark on a journey that will allow us to trace the footsteps of activists of the civil rights movement, people like Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Medgar Evers.
The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a pivotal time in America. The movement was primarily focused on equal opportunities in housing, education, and voting. Even though we have an African-American president and a First Lady in the White House for a second term, the fight continues. Much has been accomplished and much more will be done. Be a keeper by learning African-American history and sharing those stories with others.
Saturday, we're getting